computer. Lots of folks who are interested in new research at noon would love to be here, can't. So we do some recording so that folks can go back and listen at another time. Our communications team puts it up on the New College website, so we'll be able to distribute it to folks who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but who are really interested in hearing what our guests have to say. So welcome to New Research at Noon. I was telling folks this is number 5, and we will have had 6 in the series this year. Super popular. Lots of people love hearing about our TA's work and their journey to doctoral research. So thank you so much for your time. Today we have Lucy and SHIRIN with us, and we're very excited to hear about your work. Our overall theme is research with youth, and I know that that's a particularly interesting topic for lots of people because working with youth allows us to really manage to ask incredible questions that are future oriented about the lives that youth are living today, but it also involves a whole lot of ethical decisions because youth who share their life stories with us are taking risks. So we're really interested in talking to you about all those things. So to begin with, and we'll start with SHIRIN, can you tell us what courses you are a TA in this year, what university, what program you're doing your doctorate work in, and why did you decide to do doctoral research? And then we'll move to Lucy.
Thanks, Tara. Hi, everyone. Hi, Lucy. It's so good to finally put a face to the name. Our paths have crossed digitally a lot over the years, but so it's nice to see you. I'm not TAing this semester. I was TAing last semester, the Intro to Critical Equity Studies course with Professor Stan Doyle-Wood, and so it was a relatively large class, and the first time it was being offered online. So so that was a very interesting experience, and still managed to be quite fulfilling, and a really great opportunity to be able to engage with students and the other TAs. And I moved to Toronto in 2006, and I've been here since, and I've been at U of T since. I did my undergrad, my master's at U of T, and now I'm doing my PhD at Boise, where I did my master's as well. And in terms of why I decided to enroll in the PhD program and to pursue it, after I was done my master's, I sort of felt like maybe I'm done for a while with being a student and being in university. And then I worked for 4.5, 5 years in the non-for-profit sector, sort of in the field and in the area of what I had studied. And it just felt like, on superficial and personal levels, it felt that the university space is a more fulfilling space for me to be, at least at this point in my life. And because of sort of the consistency in the work that I was doing, there were a lot of questions that were coming up for me, and a lot of areas that I felt like it would be a wonderful opportunity to be able to concentrate on and focus on in an academic and from a research perspective. So that's sort of the reason why I'm back at school.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting because over the series, we have heard some people who have gone straight from undergrad to master's to PhD without stopping. And there are others, though, who just like yourself, go out in the world, do some work, and then find that there are important questions that they want to ask that lend themselves to research. Can you talk a little bit about that? What were some of the things you saw in your nonprofit work that thought, oh, this is what I need to do research on? And how did you choose the program and supervisor that you are currently working with?
So I'll start with the last question. So after I finished my undergrad, I took some time off again, mainly for immigration purposes, because I needed to work in Canada. And then very sort of unexpectedly learned of the adult ed program at Boise, and it just really resonated with me. And so my supervisor is Dr. Shahrzad Mojab, and the work that she did also resonated and seemed like a good fit. And so I did my master's with her, and I only applied for one PhD program in the adult ed department. So part of the reason was because I wanted to continue to be able to work with her, because that sort of relationship had already been established, and the thought of taking on such a this long-term commitment of doing a PhD with a new supervisor was quite daunting. So so that's the reason for choosing to work with the same supervisor. And so in terms of some of the things that came up, and so the work that I was doing was also youth focused and predominantly newcomer youth, different with different focuses, and so there were a couple of things. One was just sort of wanting the opportunity to expand on some of the themes that I was observing, and sort of the similarities and the experiences of the youth that I was working with. And the other reason, in all honesty, is that I think that I'm sure that other people's experiences are not necessarily the same, but politically, the environment I felt to be quite stifling as well, and the opportunity to discuss things and to approach things in a different way was limited. And so that ended up being a very frustrating space to be in. And it felt like, you know, having the opportunity as a student, and especially at Boise, given sort of how progressive the politics are there, having that freedom and that opportunity to think through things in a different way, in a more focused way, seems like a very refreshing space to be in. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. So I just want to highlight a few things that you mentioned. I wanted you to also tell us how you first met your supervisor, because not everybody has a relationship or has somebody in mind they want to come and work with. But what stood out for me in what you just said is that you wanted to have particular kinds of conversations, and those conversations just weren't happening in the place that you were working in. So one of the things you went looking for when you went for a PhD program and to create a relationship, and I really appreciate the way you talk about it's a multi-year relationship. And so you know, some relationships are easy, some are a little bit more difficult, but nonetheless it's a relationship that ends up being foundational in your life, the relationship with your thesis supervisor. And it's important that you're a good match in several ways, whatever ways that are most important to you. But you understood that the program already had a particular set of progressive politics, and that's what you were looking for. And I think that that's really interesting. Doing your research and finding out, you know, what kinds of conversations folks are having in the programs that you are considering looking at is important. So two things, and then we're going to move to Lucy. I wanted to ask, how did you hear about and first meet your supervisor, Professor Mojab, and also how did you what did you study in undergrad that gave you that desire to explore things from a critical perspective?
So you know, the advice when you're applying for graduate school is that you should look at the list of faculty, that the program that you're interested in, and see where there are intersections and who would be a good fit for the research that you want to do. And so Shahrzad's work and research and areas of focus were a great match. And then later I realized that I had actually met Shahrzad at different events, but never knew that she is Shahrzad. So that was a nice serendipitous happening. And sorry, your other question was around
What did you study in undergrad? What
Oh,
started
sorry.
you
Yes.
towards wanting to be involved in progressive discussions?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I did my undergrad in relatively unrelated side. I majored in English literature and minored in Middle Eastern studies and environmental policy. And I guess the Middle Eastern studies is really the only thing that has sort of stuck with me um, uh, and was related to my master's thesis, which was looking at the Iran-Iraq War. So yeah, I mean, this is an example of I came to U of T as an international student and kind of not knowing exactly what it is that I wanted to do, and those things seemed broad enough to cover some of my interests. So there wasn't a super direct sort of relationship or link between my undergrad and my master's.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. What a great start. Lucy, it's your turn. Could you tell us a little bit, excuse me, about what course you're TAing for, how's it going, and how you came to do doctoral work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also really pleased to be in the space, and I'm really grateful to you, Tara, and Nancy, of course, for organizing it. It's been really challenging doing the Senior Doctoral Fellowship without being on campus. So this is a really important venue. So thank you. And I'm really delighted to be presenting with SHIRIN today and hearing about your work and your journey. You're right, we have crossed paths in many ways. So it's really, really sweet to be sharing the space today. So how did I come to doctoral work? I think my journey was really very unorthodox. So initially I did my undergrad in business, and I had immigrated from Egypt to the United States with my partner. In 2001, I was working at the World Trade Center in Philadelphia. And obviously everything that happened then. And that was a real turning point for me. It really changed the way I saw myself living in the United States. Eventually, my husband and I moved to Canada, and that was also the same year in which I became a mother. And those two really seismic events really shifted what kind of work I wanted to do in the world, what kind of future I wanted for my children. And so I did take some time off to raise my three young children at home. And I was starting to go back into the job market. And I realized that this was a really important and a potentially transformative moment for me to pivot and shift to another field. And that was when I started to think about graduate school at OISE. I'd heard many things about it. And so I applied for my MA and I started doing my work there. And it was really interesting being in the space of OISE, which of course is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And I am in the same building with SHIRIN, but I'm in a different program, curriculum pedagogy. And it was really transformative for me to read all these people and hear all these concepts that gave names to things that I had lived with for most of my life. And hadn't ever really known how to make sense of beyond my own mind or conversations with other people from my community. And so really seeing work that touched me and moved me and held the mirror up to me in terms of how I saw myself and how I saw my community and everything that I had gone through. And at the same time, also really challenged a lot of other assumptions that I had, of other ways in which I saw myself and my community. So it was really that seeing work that was really grounded in what I would call like an Arab and a Muslim wujdan, which is the Arabic word for like a consciousness. Really seeing work that was grounded in non-Western, non-Eurocentric consciousness is, I think that's the plural of conscious. And that work really, really moved me. And that was really why I decided to kind of continue on the doctoral journey. And I'm really excited to one day be a professor because I feel like I'm so excited to design my own courses and to teach my own courses and to do research, because I feel it's really important to generate knowledge from within communities on terms that are recognizable to people of those communities. So much of what I had read and continue to read, quite frankly, is really a process that, you know, represents and narrates my people in ways that are not recognizable to me. And that's not to say that I want research to kind of paint everything in a very rosy way, but it does need to be on terms that make sense to me as a researcher and as a member of the community. I don't know, I think I went off on a tangent.
No, that's terrific. We want to know if you are teaching this semester and what are you teaching. I also would like to know, how did you find your supervisor for that first MA and then the PhD? What you described is so rich. What you described as a moment in your first set of graduate courses, being able to read things that you hadn't read before, that gave you a perspective on the world that you knew you wanted to shape your own life. How did that happen? How did you know you could find that in curriculum and pedagogy, or was that a piece of good fortune and that led to this relationship you have with your supervisor? But first, are you teaching this year, and what are you teaching?
This year I'm not teaching. I'm hoping, I'm trying to write my dissertation and focus on that. Previously, I was teaching assistant for Introduction to Equity Studies with Stan Doyle-Wood and Sophia Gaillard, and it was a really terrific experience TAing at New College. I loved it. I love the space of New College. I also previously was a teaching assistant at University of Toronto at Scarborough, where I TA'd for the course Women, Gender, and Islam and Intersections of Inequality, both with Professor Atika Hashmi. So that was what I've TA'd in the past, but I'm not TAing now. So how I discovered like the PhD program and how I came to connect with my supervisor, it was a little bit of both, honestly. I remember going to the orientation when I first joined OISU as an MA student, and one of the graduate students who was presenting that day said, you're going to learn stuff that will like blow your mind and will change the way you see your world. And certainly for me, coming from a business background, critical social theory was really a game changer for me. And some courses I took as part of a well thought out plan that I had crafted for myself before joining the MA program, but also there were some wild cards that I took. So I signed up for this course called Pedagogies of Solidarity because I needed something to take in the summer, and that ended up being a really pivotal course with Professor Ruben Gaston Vida Fernandez, who of course is my supervisor right now, and that was really a pivotal course for me when a lot of when I had joined the master's program, I had a particular focus for it. But it was really in the space of that course and the timing of it, where a lot of different currents that had been swirling around in my mind, and I didn't really have names for, the course paper for that course really gave me a chance to pin down and force myself to articulate what it was I had been kind of grappling with ever since I joined the master's program. And so I think it's really important to have I think it's super important to have a sense of direction, so that the blocks that we build for ourselves in terms of our career build on top of each other rather than are like scattered, but also these wild cards that we sometimes pick or that we choose that don't really make sense in terms of our long-term plans for ourselves. They can also prove to be very interesting, transformative turning points, and that was the case with me.
Thank you so much for that. So wonderful advice for grad school. Go in with a plan, but keep open for opportunities to engage with topics and conversations that you may not have thought were part of your plan, because you never know when that transformational moment, that aha moment might come. Fantastic. We're going to take a few questions. If folks have questions before moving on to the second set, which will focus on your thesis research, you can put your question in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask if you have a question. I have several follow-ups, so not to worry if we don't, but this is a very low-key space. Please feel free. Is there something about either SHIRIN or Lucy's journeys that have raised a question for you? Please just unmute and say, I have a question, or you can put it in the chat. We'll give folks just a few seconds to do that. Okay. I'm going to ask a question then about your research with youth. Why we put both of your research projects together under the theme research with youth is because that's what they had in common. There's lots of things that you could have decided to research. Why youth and why was it so important? We'll start with Shireen and then we'll move to Lucy and then we'll move to our next set of questions which focus in on your thesis studies.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Lucy. So as I mentioned, after I finished my my master's, I was working in the not-for-profit sector, and it sort of just so happened that the first project that I was coordinating was on the experiences of youth in diaspora around ideas of gender identity and sexual orientation within a particular community. And so youth in that sense was a little bit more broad, and because and then after that I was working with high school age students, and I think just sort of that concentration of those years yeah, just made me think about particularly the experiences of newcomers into this country, and maybe because there were also on a personal level some intersections and some convergences with my own experience. And so and you know, and also thinking about the future, and thinking about the fact that, not in a cliche sort of way, but really that in terms of the future generation, that and how change and transformation can happen. And so because the work that I was doing in both of those contexts was I'm really sorry about that. I'm so sorry. And so yeah, because the nature of that work was in part political, the topics that we were talking about, even though it wasn't taken up necessarily in an explicitly political way, in the places that I was working, sort of made me think about also how youth are politicized and how they develop the political consciousness. And so that was really the main reason for wanting to focus my research on youth and with youth.
Excellent. Lucy, your turn. Why research with youth?
I definitely didn't begin looking for a research project thinking about youth. But I think being a mother really shaped my interest in youth in really impossible to ignore ways. At the time I was looking for a research project, my 3 children were preteens and teens. And I really started to think very deeply about what it meant for them to find themselves, to think about their identities as Arab and as Muslim and as Canadian at this particular moment in time, which was 2015. And there was obviously a lot going on in the world at that time. And I think I really fell into working with youth rather than looking for it. And kind of like centering this, so part of the motivation why I do this work obviously is as a scholar and a researcher, but also as a mother. And being a mother is such a huge part of my work and what I do, and the way I approach my participants. I'm doing the kind of research that I wish that I could read about. I'm doing the kind of research that would be helpful to me as an Arab Muslim mother, the kind of research that I would like, and I do often explain to my kids and other youth in my community about not just about what we experience, but also how so much of what we're experiencing is shaped by things that maybe are on the periphery of our consciousness, or are not really in our conscious thought as we make choices about, or as we think about how we see ourselves and how we think about our identities in the world today. So yeah, I think it was really my being a mother of young teens at the time that really kind of forced me to bring my personal and professional worlds together, because I couldn't find that kind of research out there, not in the way as a mother of teenagers. I didn't see that.
Thanks so much. And for undergraduate students or even colleagues who are thinking about what's my next project, there's a lot of wisdom in what you just said. Looking for the research that you want to read that's just not there. And certainly, just to take 3 seconds to talk about my own research, when I started to put together the research project LGBTQ Families Speak Out about their experiences at school, it was because my graduate students were starting families, just the way you described, were worried about what their kids' experiences at school would be because they identified as LGBTQ families, and they wanted to research what they couldn't find. And that was a starting point for us. And the team built over the multi-year project. People came in and people came out, but every single person who joined our team in deep ways, in short ways and long ways, all wanted to see research that hadn't been done yet. So Lucy, we'll continue with you and then we'll move to SHIRIN. Can you briefly tell us the title of your project, what's it about, and why you wanted to study that topic? And after that, I'm going to ask you about an important moment in your doctoral research journey so far. Often, these moments are unplanned, and in retrospect, they ended up being really important. So the title of your project, what it's about, why you wanted to study it, and then an important moment in the journey.
Okay, so the title of my project is DAPCA on Turtle Island, Pedagogy and the Multicultural Shaping of Settler Citizenship in Canada, which is really a mouthful. What DAPCA is Palestinian folk dancing. And what I'm really exploring is, I'm exploring how do people who are racialized in particular ways understand their belonging and their citizenship in Canada. It's a critical performance ethnography. Some of you may know that an ethnography is when you kind of really immerse yourself in a community or a group in order to understand its culture from the point of view of someone in that culture. So we look at things of like ethnographers, look at questions of, well, what do they do? What do they say? Why do they say and do those things? How do they attach meaning to what they do and say? And so why that topic? It was a really interesting moment where I came to that topic. I was in the year 2016, I was taking my kids to a lot of protests. And there was a moment in a protest, I think it was around the Quebec mosque shooting, when one of my kids turned to me and said, I don't want to be in these spaces anymore. It feels really heavy. And it really alerted me to how I was really trying to shape them and trying to help them make sense of the crazy things that were happening in the world through ways that were not always necessarily good fits for their personalities or uplifting for them. There was a lot of nihilism in the world at that moment. And that was really when I started to think about, well, what about joyful things that Arab youth do? What about joyful practices that Muslim kids do? How can we think about ourselves in collective ways that are uplifting, that don't center suffering and victimhood? And at the same time, I had been a part of this dance group already for a while, and it suddenly kind of clicked as being the perfect way through which to explore questions of subjectivity, which very loosely means inner consciousness. And I really wanted to move away from the victim narrative. Not that there's I think it's important in that we understand how experiences of victimhood and oppression structure and create subjectivity for Arab and Muslim youth in these important ways. But also there are other spaces and other ways through which we can study those kinds of things. So that was really why I decided to study it through folk dancing and through DAPCA. It's through joy. It's through a collective joyful identity, and I don't know much research that approaches studying Muslim youth in that way.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're finding out? You're probably analyzing your findings as we speak. A little bit about what you're finding out, and then back to that question, an important moment in your research journey?
So my findings.
You're fine.
So my findings. So it was an interesting year when I began doing the study. It was the year of Canada 150, which of course was Canada's celebration of 150 years of Confederation, and it was a really interesting moment for understanding how the youth in my study really understood themselves in relation to being Canadian citizens and how they make themselves legible in particular ways. I found that even, and I was very interested in Indigenous relations. So if I had to kind of like frame my work under like a broader umbrella of what it's about, I would say at its heart, my work is about Indigenous settler relations. And when we speak about Indigenous settler relations, most often, certainly in the public discourse, it always seems to me to be an Indigenous relationship with white settlers. And not all settlers are white. And so for me, kind of thinking about what my findings are, understanding what it means to dance a relationship to Palestine, which is what Dabka is, on Turtle Island, I was really surprised to find how whiteness and coloniality structures relationships between people who are racialized or visible minorities like Arabs or Muslims, and also Indigenous people. So the ways in which many participants articulated their belonging to Canada was in ways that really understood what it meant to be Canadian in very white ways. And there are strong reasons for that. I published a paper at the end of 2019 that kind of traced this relationship between visible minorities, Indigenous people, and Canada as a colonial nation that conditions entry into Canadian citizenship on an oath to the Queen. And so I'm an immigrant to Canada, and when I became Canadian, I had to make an oath of allegiance to the Queen, which is funny because I'm British and I never had to make an oath of allegiance to the Queen as a British person. And so this is really kind of what I'm tracing. I'm looking at lateral relations between groups of people like Arab and Muslim people, like Indigenous people. But one of my most important findings is how whiteness is really structuring those lateral relations. A really important moment, I think it was this kind of realization that I had early on when I was with my participants, when I was asking them questions, and now as I'm writing up their stories and kind of making sense of the data that I have, is I'm a mother, and I really think about these participants in as much as someone who is not a mother to someone can think about, but I really think about them as my own kids, in the sense of what questions would I be comfortable asking these youth. So before I asked a question, I really had to check in with myself. Is this something that I would be comfortable asking my own kids? As I write their stories, is this some way in which I would be comfortable with someone representing my kids' stories? And the same thing in terms of analyzing my findings. So that really, what the first time it really hit me was when I was asking what are seen as, you know, typical ethnographic anthropological questions, and I realized that that question didn't sit right with me as a mother. I wouldn't want someone to ask one of my kids that question, and that was a moment that continues to kind of I continue to be taken back to this idea of what would I want for my own kids, and I can't really do the things that I wouldn't ask or write as a researcher.
Thank you so much. That's great. SHIRIN, we're going to move on to you. The title of your project, what's it about, why you wanted to study the topic, and then we'll go to an important moment in your journey. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tara. Lucy, I really admire how eloquently you're able to talk about your research. It's really wonderful. And just anecdotally, as you were talking, which I'm sure you already know about this, but Rafeef Ziada, who's a Palestinian scholar and an activist and poet, has this really great spoken word piece about the oath to the Queen, where she says that, you know, people who don't have English as a first language are asked to take this oath, and there's a part where you have to say, I pledge your allegiance to the Queen and all of her heirs, and heirs is spelled with an H, and it's such a, so she says the Queen and all of her heirs, and I mean, I encourage you to, it's such a powerful piece, but that just reminded me of that, and so I decided to, so I came into the PhD program knowing that I wanted to look at the Canadian state's de-radicalization programming, federal and on a provincial level. And that's sort of the extent of what I knew I wanted to do. And I think really the main reason for it was that, you know, these conversations in the context of Canada about cohesion and belonging, particularly Canada as a settler colonial state, and the ways in which the expectation of young people, or the ways in which young people are shaped to think about their identities in particular ways, and about their relationship to Canada and their own histories. And I just remember there was one moment at my previous job where I came across a conference that was being sponsored that was about building resiliency for youth. And I was like, oh, what is this? And I realized that it's basically just another way to refer to de-radicalization, and a nicer word to refer to de-radicalization, and it was looking at particular communities only, and all of this. And so that's where it sort of piqued my interest to learn more about it. And you know, one of the wonderful things about the advantages of working with my supervisor, whose own research focuses and areas of work is so similar to what it is that I'm doing, is that thankfully and very gratefully, it has created opportunities to be part of research that has sort of expanded. It sort of expanded the way that I think about the issue. And so because of the project that we were doing, looking at young refugees coming into Canada, it then sort of made me realize that this idea of building resiliency, there's a new, relatively contemporary agenda of building refugee resiliency that's not just in Canada, but it's on a global scale. And so that was sort of, it took it a slightly different direction. And so I'm in my third year. I've just submitted my comprehensive paper for review. So there's still a lot of question marks in terms of the way that I want to approach my research, and sort of the kind of data that I'll be looking at, and whether I will actually be engaging with youth or not. So those are still question marks that I'm really hoping after this comprehensive paper process is over, I'll have some answers to. But loosely right now, I think that in terms of the title for my research, it's Refugee Youth Policy and Practical Implications of De-radicalization and Resiliency. And you know, I guess at this stage of my research, it feels like the more I read about something, I'm like, oh my God, there's all of this other stuff that's also very closely related, and it's like a whole other world that just keeps opening up and opening up. So the challenge is going to be to be able to sort of figure out what its limits are going to be, and what the outlines of that limit are going to look like. And you know, I think that really the past 2.5 years all have sort of been, there have been a lot of learning moments, and I think that so far, at least in terms of the stage that I'm at, the comprehensive paper process, which Sadia, you were mentioning earlier, you're doing as well, and it's vastly different in my program at OISE. Yours is so much more challenging in my mind, because you have to, the requirements for it seem a lot more challenging, but having the freedom to sort of just write one big paper about one topic has really been a wonderful opportunity to sort of focus in a little bit. And so that's been a helpful moment so far in the PhD journey.
Thank you so much. That's great. Given that you haven't actually decided whether or not you're going to interview youth, And we have a whole bunch of very interesting questions in the chat. There was a big response to this idea of, is this something I would ask my kids? How do I represent my kids? And in terms of representation and in terms of this critique of resiliency, what options are there? You could interview youth, or you could do something else. What might that something else be, and why might that be attractive? Have you played with that idea in this big paper that you are working on for your comms?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I think would be interesting is sort of looking at it from a policy perspective, because this agenda of this resiliency agenda that in a lot of ways is a post 9/11, like it has existed obviously prior to that, but it has existed in a different form. The appearance of it has been different. And so as more of a post 9/11 phenomena, and given the amount of policy that exists, I mean, it's truly just mind-boggling. Like, you read one policy paper and then it leads you to 20 other policies and forums and organizations and institutions and groups, and that are all about, and they all sort of say the same thing. And so looking at it from a policy perspective would be interesting. The other thing that I have been sort of toying around with the idea is looking at the Canadian context of settlement agencies and seeing how much that factors into the policies and the agenda of settlement agencies that work in the resettlement of refugees specifically, and sort of maybe ultimately being able to develop an alternative sort of curriculum around, how else can we think through the idea of settling refugee youth. And so that's another idea as well. And so with that, maybe it would be that my research participants would be the settlement workers and not maybe the youth who are participating in that. So they're like three sort of big things that are swimming around.
Wonderful. And I'm so interested that you gave yourself the opportunity to stay open to the design of your research and use the opportunity of comps, which often feels like, although we sometimes use the word milestone, passing your comps, often feels like a hoop to jump through, but there are ways that you can use it to deepen your questions of what you want your work to be. I saw a little bit of energy in the chat in response to both of your work. There are questions about resiliency and ethics. I wanted to know if anybody wanted to ask either SHIRIN or Lucy a little bit more about that, or even just share your reactions to what they've said. It's always wonderful for people to know the things that they are saying are resonating. So Jeff and Sam and Melissa and June, anything you'd like to share with SHIRIN and Lucy at this point before we go to the third set of questions?
Hi, so I don't have my video on, is that okay?
For sure.
Okay, thanks. These are so great. I wish I was still doing my PhD so I could get some guidance from you on how to do it. Your methods and approaches are really excellent. I was just thinking in relation to the resilience question. So, I mean, I made a choice also in my dissertation to interrogate power or the powerful as opposed to the less powerful or the oppressed or whatever. And that was, it had a lot to do with my own subject position. But I was thinking in relation to the policy question that it would be really interesting to look at a kind of genealogy of resilience. So how this notion emerges, in what context it emerges, why it emerges, and who are making the decisions around it. Right, because very often, like, some person will say the word and then it just becomes kind of, so there's no real thought, and there's this kind of naturalized environment where, we celebrate resilience. So that I think would be outstanding, and it kind of does help you also deal with the questions of, your subject position in relation to young people. And just on Lucy, on the, would I ask my children this? It's also been a kind of pedagogical approach for me. So when I'm in the classroom, I actually, without infantilizing students, of course, and without transforming them into my own children, right? But that does remain. It's such a brilliant way of putting it in your research, because I think that I do that in the classroom too. Is, how would I want my child to be in a classroom with an adult? I think it's a wonderful kind of ethical response to the work that we do. So thank you both really so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Sam has a question for both SHIRIN and Lucy. What's the biggest thing to adjust to when you were starting the PhD program? Both of you had rich and busy lives, family lives, work lives, and then, there's the academic work lives you take on when you join a PhD program. What was the biggest thing to adjust to? SHIRIN, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. I think that in all honesty, there are so many aspects of being a PhD student, and especially sort of at this stage in my life, that I find to be such a luxurious opportunity. Like, what a luxury to be able to wake up and my primary task to be to read and to write. But unfortunately, that's not the only thing that one has to do. And so I think the biggest adjustment was sort of, well, the first one for me was adjusting from a 9-to-5 life to one that is less structured, but in some ways a lot more demanding than a 9-to-5 structure. And I think that for the first year and a half, really being able to sort of juggle all of the expectations and all of the things that you have to do as a graduate student. So there are your program requirements, there are your things that you have to do outside of your program to build your CV, because you need to have a strong CV to be able to get all of the grants that you do have to apply for. So there's just, so sometimes I think it becomes hard, it's easy to sort of lose perspective on what is the main task that you're in the program for to do, which is to do research and to write your thesis. There's a lot happening on the outside of it that is competing. And so I think that on that level, on sort of the more personal, logistical level, that's been the most challenging thing. And after coursework, at least for me, things feel a little bit less daunting and a little bit less overwhelming, because it feels that there's more time that I can organize around how I want to approach things. So that's really been, and I think the other thing for me was that, the expectations from a PhD student are different than the expectations of when I was doing my master's. And so your sort of master's ends up being sort of the building blocks of starting to think as a researcher and sort of coming and maybe developing a sort of framework for yourself to maybe discipline is too harsh of a word, but there is a lot of rigor and discipline required to get things done in the time frame that you have to get things done as a PhD student. So those have all been adjustments for sure. And sorry, if I can just very quickly, Melissa, on the point that you made, and it's really interesting and really important, because one of the things in terms of sort of looking at this history of resiliency is that it encompasses so many different fields and sectors as well. So there's security, there is social work, there's settlement and immigration policies and border securities. And so it's such a, it's so all, and education as well. Yes, absolutely. And it's so all encompassing, and also really interesting that Canada, actually one of the leading scholars of resilience is a Canadian scholar, and one of the biggest sort of research centers on resilience is based out of Halifax. So that connection, that Canadian connection, has also been really interesting for me to discover.
Thanks so much, Shireen. Just a brief comment on some of the things you said, then we'll go to Lucy on the adjustment question, and then we are going to close up with the final question, which is, who do you want to read your research? What difference do you want your research to make? So, but Lucy, we're going to go to you first for the adjustment question, but just to comment on Shireen, I think that that's right. There are a lot of expectations. You have to do two major things at once. You have to build an academic life because building an academic life as a grad student gives you that firm foundation to then, find a paying academic life, right, afterwards. Yet at the same time, at the center of building an academic life is this big, huge thesis study that you are doing, and actually allows you to train yourself how to do research. You can take research methodology courses, but it's not really until you design your own research, go out and collect your data and do your data analysis and have that first big experience of doing a major study that you learn. And yes, it's about reading and writing and thinking, and we need time for that. And while you're building an academic life, including doing TA work, and for my colleagues here who are already working on full-time contracts, it's really very hard. And just because we're there, what I used to do when I was finishing off my thesis is I would deliberately plan a full week of reading and writing time whenever I could, and I would just actually go away and not engage in my other academic life projects, because there is such a thing. And even if you can't, go away, we're under COVID, but somehow find a place. Sometimes I would switch apartments with a friend of mine, just to not be in a place where you feel compelled to access the computer to do other things. This is your week away. We used to use the word retreat. But Lucy, let's go to adjustment, and then we'll ask you to start us on who do you want to read your research. We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to make one quick point that, when I think about Shireen's work, like unpacking resiliency and how the state has really appropriated it and is re-signifying it to mean all these really insidious things, and how my work is looking at, how the framework of multiculturalism is also a way, another form of disguise, what I call disguised state violence, where you can only be legible as a Canadian citizen if you articulate yourself in these very particular ways. And so I really look forward to reading your work. Okay, very quickly, academic writing was a big issue for me when I first became a graduate student, and in particular the PhD, because that was when I started to look into publishing my MA thesis. So academic writing was a big thing for me, and I'm happy to respond to any questions about that. What is called imposter syndrome, which is really a catch-all phrase for many things. Am I worthy of this space? Am I worthy of doing this work? I'm not seeing a lot of representation in terms of the faculty. I'm not seeing as much as I thought I would see. So that was another way in which I felt like an imposter, finding my own voice, having the confidence to say things as I saw them, albeit quite rigorously, and also a different, not just this moment, but many, the last, for a long time, it really seems like there are so many important critical things pulling my attention in so many different directions, and kind of deciding, what is my battle going to be? What am I going to focus my energies on? And what am I going to lend my support to in other ways that don't kind of take me away from the main thrust of what I'm doing? Narrowing my focus, yeah, but also being really mindful about where I put my energy. I'm mindful of these are the things that are our core things I'm going to support. These are the things I'm going to support, but in ways that don't take up so much of my energy. And then pivoting to, what was it? Who do I want to read my work? Honestly, my community. So when I started this project, it was very much about, my kids, but it was also very much about my community. you know, I'm Arab Muslim. I'm white passing, as many Arab Muslims are, and you know, really kind of it was started out as this, you know, exercise in speaking to my community about what I saw at the time as aspirational whiteness, and I still see it as that way, but now I see it in a much more nuanced, textured way, because racialization colonizes and colonization racializes, and these forces are always working together. So my work is really for my community, and for, I hope one day my work will touch someone the way particular work touched me and made me feel this is what I really have to do.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And SHIRIN, who do you want to read your work?
I'll be super quick. I mean, I think I would want everyone who's interested in this and works in this field to read it, but more than that, I want it to be accessible for them to read it. And so, yeah, that's my hope, that it'll be able to resonate with people regardless of sort of which field they're coming from and which practice they're coming from.
Wonderful. And that will be a whole other set of questions you'll ask yourself about the design of your research. Well, we're a little after 1, and I know how busy everybody is. This has been an absolutely wonderful session. Thank you both. We did a whole lot of work, not only about your research journeys and your journey to come to do a PhD, but also about research ethics, research design, and building an academic life. And I know that everybody really enjoyed having this time to spend with you. I'm going to keep the chat on so you can see all of the thank yous that you are getting. And we wish you all the very, very, very best as you continue. And we'll look forward to reading your work. And congratulations on where you've come so far. And thanks so much for being with us today. Could we all unmute our microphones for a second and just say thank you to SHIRIN and Lucy with our real voices, and then we'll keep the chat on so you can read all the thank yous. Okay, on 3.
Thank you.
1, 2, 3. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you so much for your wonderful
Thank
energy.
you, everybody. Bye. Thank you so much, Tara. This was such a wonderful opportunity, and what a wonderful group of people to be with. I really appreciate it.
I thought it went just really beautifully, and thank you both once again. I'm going to stop recording.